Some people were really good with cod, like the group that I come from. And in a textbook, it's called Katemoot. But in our translation in Ayajutham, it's Katemu. And Katemu translated means always inviting people to a feast.
I actually felt a little bit more connected with the land once I learned about the fish traps that we're going to talk about today. And so I'd like to introduce Hereditary Chief Wedlidi Speck.
Welcome. When we say Checha Hathlich, that's the Comox way of welcoming you. And Patpatnas means friends. And if we say Cheje, we mean relatives. And if we say Hegus, it means a leader. Or Hehegus means leaders. And so we work from a place that in Salish tradition, everyone who teaches, everyone who helps to heal, everyone who does chores in the family is a leader. It takes leadership to do those things, so welcome. And thank you for coming, I really do. I appreciate that, is when you come to learn about our people, and it really makes sense. And so I want to talk a little bit about who the people are. And I want to say that I want to acknowledge, the traditional territory of the Pentlatch, who for thousands of years have had a relationship with the land, with the waters, and the landscape. Their fingerprint is seen, in the fish weirs or in the places in which have paintings or carvings. And Chrome Island, lots of different places have let us know that people have been here for many thousands of years. And I start off with the Pentlatch because the Pentlatch people are the historical owners of this territory. They were joined by a tribe called the Aixen, just the way it sounds, Aixen. And Aixen translated means people of the sun. That was around 1830. And then they were joined by the Comox people, who around 1850 or in around that range came south. And they were forced out of their territory by the Likwukta and came for safe harbor here. But because they were historical enemies of the Aixen and Pentlatch, there was a war here between those two groups. And so it went on for a while, but after a while they decided it was better to have peace, and so they made a peace treaty. And how they did that is that they would marry into one another's tribes, and so therefore the children would know that they're family. And so we are all connected to one another in that way. But what's important is that when we think about the Pentlatch had two ancestors that came from the sky. One was called Hikwitin and the other one was called Kweemen. And they were the founders of this whole tribe we call Pentlatch. And the Pentlatch were broken down into 4 tribes, actually. There was a group called Pentlatch, Pentlatchmoot, Suksen, and Sa'atlam. And we know, going backwards, we know that Sa'atlam is the non-native way of saying Qualicum. And Suksen, there's a story there where at one time the Likwukta traveled from the Cape Mudge area down to Whidbey Island to retaliate on an incident that took place against one of their family members. And so they had a war with the Whidbey Island people and wiped them out. Those who were attending the wedding at the time from other tribes decided to join the Klalam and come after the Likwukta. So they made their way up, and they figured there was probably about 10,000 of them, Salish, and they got as far as Deep Bay. And in Deep Bay, they thought it was Likwukta, and so they attacked them and wiped every man, woman, and child. Except for one family who were visiting someone else. And so the Suksen on that day disappeared. But their territory is Deep Bay, and also what we know today as Denman Point, or Village Point it was called. And so those are the places in which the Suksen lived. The Pentlatchmoot and the Pentlatch lived upriver. And that was their territory, around the Condentry Bridge area, and they had houses there. And so these are the families When we look at the Pentlatch family, we hear the famous name Nimnim. Well, Nimnim, he was related, we'll say, to the Frank family. And so the Frank family today, Norman Frank, well, Andy Frank, Norman Frank, Kerry Frank, the Pentlatch chieftainship has come down to him. The Pentlatch Moot to Rob Everson, because he was adopted, their family were adopted by the Andy Frank. And then the Suxin, that one family, that's the Billy family today. And the Sa'alam, the Qualicum, there was a guy by the name of Qualicum Tom and a fellow by the name of Mahoy. And they were the last two people left there. And they were very busy. There's a big tribe there now. And so those are the families of the Pentlatch. And the Aixen family, when they moved down, they joined into with the Pentlatch, and they lived upstream with them. And that's my family. And so our family, Ixen is the ancestor, which means sun in human form. Aixen means people of the sun. It's a plural form. And my grandmother in 1930 was the very last Aixen. So she, when she married my grandfather, there's a whole bunch of us. And so recently, my Uncle George and I have been working on revitalizing the family. And so we revitalized the clans as well. And there's 5 clans that belong to the Aixen. And so we're very cultural and we're very much alive and well. And then we'll say, when we're looking at the Comox of the 5 tribes of the Comox, there are 2 left. And one is called the Sathlut and the other is called Sasitla. But together they have 4 clans. And so there's lots of families. And why I say the small number of Comox, there was a time in the past where all these North Vancouver Island Salish were called Sathlut and Sa-Lut. Easy, yeah? Sa-Lut. Important you know that. Sa-Lut. And so the 14 tribes lived together in an alliance called the Sathlut Whale House Alliance. And that was how they organized. There were a number of tribes that lived together, worked together, and celebrated together, and had ceremony together. And one of the groups, one of the tribes emerged. The name was Komokwe. And this particular group decided that he wanted to be top dog. And so they decided to potlatch against the Sathlut, who were the top of the tribes and the alliance named after. And the Sathlut lost. And so the Komokwe came on top, and they gave another big potlatch and said, from this day on, we're going to be called the Comox. And so that's where the name Comox emerges. It's not that old. But at the same time, they all didn't agree. And so 9 of the tribes said, nah, not doing it. So 5 were left, and they became the 5 tribes of the Comox. They're the only ones they call Comox. The others maintain their Sathlut status. And so when the Likuta pushed the Comox south, you'll see it in books that you may read, they're only talking about the 5 tribes. They're not talking about the others. And so that's really important to know. And so there's lots of detailed history. But anyway, it's a really amazing culture in the valley here. There's lots of things to know and to see and to learn. And I'm glad that you've come to learn some of it. I won't give you a test at the end of this, but most certainly would say that there's a lot of rich things to consider, right? So I'm one of the chiefs of the Aixen, and that's where I speak from. I don't speak for the Pentlatch, and I don't speak for the Comox. And part of our cultural way is to make sure that people understand that. And so if I say anything wrong, then you can't go blame the Pentlatch, or you can't go blame the Comox. It's just Wedlidi and Aixen. And I have to honor and stand by my tribal name then, right? We're held accountable. Which means if I said something that was not right or said something that was degrading to any of the others, I'd have to give a feast to clean that up, right? And things like that. So it's really important. Recently, I've been involved with a project in the community here in Comox. And an archaeologist by the name of Jesse Morin and I teamed up and we worked with all the cultural families of the Pentlatch, Aixen, and Comox, and we identified all the hereditary chiefs, leaders in those families. We put together all their oral history. We put together their crests. We identified all the names that went with each, and we've started to have our first set of meetings as hereditary chiefs. And it's amazing. In some cases, it's between 70 and 100 years since families have done that, and it's really amazing to see. It's fabulous. So what we're going to see in the next probably 20 years is just a blossoming of culture in this community. It's so good to see, because the drivers for it are people that have a great sense of self, a sense of place and a sense of belonging. And so with that, we hope that our children will know where they come from, who they are, and where they're going. That they won't have that colonized kind of injury that a lot of people walk with today. We want to change things. We want to bring pride back to the people, right? And that's why we're doing what we're doing. There's a beautiful video that they put together to do this, and we should probably try to find it and share it. It's really lovely. And so, but I also want to say that there are sometimes wrinkles, and one of the wrinkles is that no matter where you go across the country, is that as cultural people get strong, those who are known as chief and councils get defensive. Because they believe or say that they're the official representatives of all the people through a parliamentary system. In the Indian Act, that's true, but their responsibility is for Indian Reserve lands, not for traditional land, which are the property and of hereditary chiefs and families, right? And so that's kind of like to be aware of as well. Some good material out there. Is there any questions? If not,
so many, but now's not the time.
Yeah. Okay, so with that was my introduction, and I'll do a little bit more talking about fish weirs with someone else who's going to do some talking, and talk about hereditary chief role in fish weirs a little later on when we're down that way. So welcome again. Glad you're here.
It's really exciting, and we just say this is how we know it at this moment, and we're always learning.
So the family I come from, the Aixen, the ancestor Aixen is the name of all the territory of the people. So if your tribe was Komenoks, as in the case of Lochburr Inlet, the whole inlet is called Komenoks. And so when you look at Sa'alam, they're not just calling it like the typical non-indigenous people would. Its territory is named Sa'alam, is named after the ancestor. And so that's what we do. And so when you think about that, the people, all the families come together, and they primarily live together in the winter, and they have their ceremony, and they celebrate being together. They have a group identity that way. But in the spring, summer, and fall, they scatter. And all the clans or all the different families go to their fish weirs, go to their berry places, and so forth. And so the family who would own these ones here would come here from the Pentlatch, and that would be theirs. They would be clear who owned it. The important part, you got a question?
Yeah, so all these different fish weirs, would they all be owned by,
yes.
Say some would be owned by the Comox, right next to it would be a Pentlatch?
Well, prior it was all just Pentlatch.
Okay,
yeah. So prior to, it was say 1830, it was all Pentlatch.
Yeah.
And so the difference is that when you'll see in a low tide, if you're driving along the dike and you see all the fish weirs there, you'll know for certain that the last one closest to the mouth belongs to Nimnim, the head chief. And so what the head chief would do is that he would go down to his fish weir, he would take the first salmon, and he would do a first salmon rite before anybody else could do it. And once that's done, he puts the entrails into the water, and the ceremony is to send the spirit of the salmon back to let them know that we're worthy of receiving you, right? So it's really important. 1830, the Pentlatch had to say, okay, where are we going to put the Aixen? So very consciously said, okay, you're the next up. And so when the Comox came down, they would be the next up. Although the Comox, in their aggressive kind of way, tried to say that they owned the right to first salmon right. But lots of us who know the history go, no, it's not true. But it always belonged to the head chief, right? And so then they divvied up the territory, but they had to talk about where that was going to be. And so by 1860, things had radically changed, right? And so we had to look at what territories were people going to use here. But the Aixen people, even though they moved south, they would still go back to some key territories to do their fish. My great-grandfather, for instance, would go to the place now that they call Miracle Beach. There's a tiny little river there. He had a camp there, and they would gather fish there. And so people would go to different sites to get cod, and so forth. The Pentlatch would go to Hornby Island and have deer runs. And they would run deer into nets, and they would be able to take kill the deer and bring them home, things like that. And on the southern part, there's a village there near Crome Island where they would gather their deep fish, you know, their cods and things like that. But the really important part is just to pay attention to where the people had their carvings, because that was a significant statement of their origins or their territory. Crome Island has probably the most carved stones in the Pentlatch territory. The Aixen owned the territory from Campbell River all the way down to Point Holmes. And they went over also to the southern part of Quadra Island. And they have, I think it's up to 92 rock carvings on the southern part of that place, just south of the lighthouse. And it's said that the oldest carbon dated stone is 4,700 years. So we'll say that that they'd been in relationship, we'll say, with that teaching for a long time. So it was really important to them. And when you look at the teachings, you can see the sun design, the killer whale design, the bear design, and all the designs that come along with the clans, right? It's really quite fascinating. On the Crome Island rock carvings, the two in particular, one is a human figure, and behind it is the sun. So Hequatin came down as a thunderbird, but became a man represented, and Quayamin came from the sun. So those two crests are actually significant in this territory. It's really fascinating.
Are thunderbirds real?
Are thunderbirds real? Yes. Yes. You would call them aliens today, but spaceships, no. But anyway, the thunderbird in our culture is real. It's a part of the myth world. And so when we step into the myth world, it's another reality. It's a landscape of consciousness that if you train to go there and you come back, you will be really spiritually strong. If you aren't able to do that, you will always just see the actual object of the world. You know? It's a fascinating piece. That's a whole conversation.
Are the crests then to indicate ownership of that sort of fishing rights? Or is it also information about what to catch when?
The rock carvings, you mean? Yeah, they're to let you know more about the spiritual nature of the people. And so, but it says that it's the fingerprint that they hear, right? And the part of the fingerprint says that, okay, this is their territory. And so it really helps to know that. And so, sometimes they've used they talk about a heart weir, icy whale, right? And so part of the significant part of our history, the whale house for the Sathlut and for the Comox, talks about how they get together and live together and play together. For the Pentlatch, the whale to them is connected to the preservation of the culture. It's a symbol of strength. But theirs is the canoe. And there's a big rock out here somewhere that they tied their canoes to during the time of the flood. They have a little different story than the Sathlut. But the interesting part of the history here is that when we think about timeline, go to the origin story. And it talks about a time where the people said that there was hardly any water. It was dry like this, and people had to go a long ways out to get food. And then we'll say one of the elders had a dream that a flood was going to come. So they prepared for that, and the flood did come. And then after that, we'll say that white whale landed on the mountains and was covered by the glacier. So when we're looking at timeline, we're looking at a time of fire, we're looking at a time of water, and we're looking at a time of ice, right? And so the chronology of time, I think, is really important. So the idea is with the kids, get them to research when was the fire period, when was the flood period, or when was the ice period, glaciation. When did it start? Which one we're talking about? Yeah.
Wedlidi, I remember when we met in June, you talked a little bit about the flood story, and the one that we've been sharing in our district is not necessarily the one that's...
It's not Pentlatch.
It's not Pentlatch.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of times in our cultural way, we're influenced by the Comox. Yeah. And so a lot of our stories and a lot of the language is around what the Comox do and not the Pentlatch. Yeah. And I think it's just nice to add the two, and I think that the Pentlatch stories are simple, but they're really nice. Yeah. And it's okay to have two flood stories. Yeah. It's just what we have to guard against always is ownership. Is the idea that there's one truth, and that's not necessarily the way. And so the other part that we need to be aware of, and this is where I'm in study right now, is language. And so when we're looking at language, there's a Pentlatch language, there's a Comox language, we call it Ayajutham. The Ayajutham language is what we call today the Comox language. But it was Sathlut, because when you say Comox, you're only talking about 5 tribes, you're not talking about 14. Right? And so when we say Ayajutham, there's Pentlatch, Ayajutham, and Kwakwala. And so what happens is that for thousands of years, they lived in close proximity, Sathlut, to the Likhukta, who were a Kwakwakiak group, who spoke Kwakwala. And so through that relationship, the language of the Kwakwala people started to come into this territory. So Pentlatch is actually, the root word for Pentlatch is Pentlis. And Pentlis is Kwakwala, which means that when you eat, your tummy sticks out a little bit. It's like, oh, it's been a good dinner. And so Pentlatch is a variation of that. And one of the chiefs were called Pentlalis, which is an outright Kwakwala word that says that as a chief, you're satiated from all the abundance of food that you have around you. It's like pretty amazing. So the language and some of the concepts have been brought into the Pentlatch. And so for actually Yadan, which means rattle, that's what the Pentlatch call it, and it's Kwakwala. So there's so many words that I'm discovering in Pentlatch that are actually brought in from north. And the same with Ayajutham. The language has a lot of Kwakwala in it now. And it's not because of recent times, it's because that those historical marriages. The name of Comox, for instance, it comes from Kwakwala. It means wealthy in Kwakwala. The name Komeno, which is the name of another Salish or Sathlut tribe, that means where wealth comes from. So at some point, the Salish tribes liked that term better and put it over top of their Salish name and became known as that. And so when you start looking at this, you kind of saying, what other influences are there? And then I started realizing that the primary ceremony for all of the 14 tribes is a mask called a Swaikwai. And it's a dance that's done, and it's a beautiful dance. And so everyone, you had to own one in order for you to be in ceremony. And Mary Clifton, the last speaker of the Ayajutham for this tribe, said that there were 14 masks, one for each tribe. So we know there were 14 tribes. Somebody in modern times has started to say, well, there was only 10 tribes. And so we have to kind of keep correcting people around that. The important thing, I think, when we're looking at language and ceremony, is that at some point the Pentlatch, the Sathlut, and the Comox started marrying and receiving ceremony from the northern Kwakwaka'wakw people. So we had the Hamatsa ceremony, we had the warrior ceremony, we had the Tukwid ceremony. Lots of ceremonies that belong to them up there now are part of this. And so it's good to realize that this was a culture then that wasn't pure Salish. It was a culture that was a mixture of both the Pentlatch and the Kwakwala people, and a blended. So it became a hybrid. And so did the Sathlut, and so now is the Comox. So it's not that we're no longer a pure Salish tradition. And if we were pure Salish tradition, you wouldn't have hereditary chiefs. They don't have hereditary chiefs. They have community leaders, hegus. Then we'll say when you look at a tribe, they don't have traditional true Salish don't have clans, but we all have clans. So it shows you the amount of acculturation that took place between the tribes. It's pretty interesting stuff. It just never ends, man. Just good stuff. Yeah, it's good stuff.
You guys bring your tent for staying over and having a fire. And
Yeah. Kumbaya, you know.
Now you know why your language questions, if you email us a language question, why it's difficult.
Yeah. Well, and also there's politics attached to it, right? You've got some younger people saying, we're Salish, you know, and other people saying, we're Kwakwala, you know, and somebody in the middle, like the calmness of myself, says that we're a hybrid. And it's true. Yeah.
We learned a lot about these traps and how these traps work from Nancy Green and David McGee, her husband. Nancy did her PhD on studying the fish traps because she was out here walking and noticed all these wooden stakes. And there's a lot of them, like right behind Nick, if you look up that way, you can sort of see the outline of the lead line right there. There's lots of them all up and down on both sides, but the lead lines always go from the shore into the trap.
And we learned from the Guardians as well, Corey and Randy Frank, and then we've just been kind of layering knowledge on top of that. But that's our journey and how we learned about it.
They would all go in together from the lead line when they encountered it. It would come in here, and they always go to deeper water, and this is the deeper water. But there's netting across the whole trap. You can't see it because we don't have enough bamboo, but there would be netting all around the trap. And then the fish would swim around in here, and just picture, and then the tide starts going out. And they're always coming this end because this is where the deeper water is. They might turn, and this would sort of just shoot them back into the trap. If some of them tried to get out, these wings were to funnel them back into the trap. And then as the tide went out, the fish would be caught, and the people would catch the right amount.
The knowledge of this trap was based on fish behavior and from thousands of years of study of fish behavior, right? So a fish knows that when the tide's going out, they have to head to deeper water, but those big stakes there in the lead line would be look like predators to the fish, so they wouldn't get near them and go through them, but they would head up this way, still going to deeper water, so it would lead them right into the trap. And the heart trap was a little different than the which one is this? This is the herring.
This is the heart
This
trap.
is the herring?
Yeah.
Herring. So the herring, they discovered the main difference between the two traps, the heart and the chevron, was that the heart trap had a little wider opening because the herring fish, their behavior was more schooling. There wasn't that idea of sort of more individual, like a salmon might try to escape, but the herring stuck together. So they didn't escape as easily as the salmon did. So the herring would come in as a wider opening, and so they didn't escape as much as a salmon might, and they headed towards this end as well.
I think it was about 1830 was the one carbon dated piece, and it originally because around that time, 1830 is around the time the Eichsen came south, and so we'll say that they were used for a while afterwards, and then we'll say about 1850 the Liquidat came down in the middle of 50s, and then we'll say there was an Indian agent superintendent named Vowell. And he was the one that I think it was 1876 that said that, look, we are now going to, by our own choice as a government, going to call these three groups Comox. And then they began the dismantling of what they called, they didn't call them fish weirs, they just called them devices. So when they look in the history books in public policy, the destroying of devices meant fish weirs. Yeah, and so that happened around that time. Yeah, and so it's interesting the timeline. When you look at the timelines, a lot of the colonial behavior happened, you know, and so people were by law forced to discontinue ancient practices.
The canoes would have been here, possibly with nets or something, scooping the fish out.
There were primarily 4 quarters of a typical big house. A big house was known as a Kwakwaka'wakw or a Kwakwala style home, and a longhouse was Salish, right? And so in this community, they were both. And so the families who were Salish used the corners as well. There was a definite name for where you lived in that house. And so every quarter, you had so many boxes and so many baskets. And you knew if you filled those boxes with salmon, you were going to survive for the year, right? And so it was, and then would say if the family met and said we're going to have a feast, there were extra boxes. And so there was one of our chiefs said that the boxes started from the floor and touched the ceiling, right? And so it's just in terms of managing resources, we didn't go to the grocery store. You had to think about that. And so it was very well thought out. Yeah. And so when they filled their boxes, they were done. Yeah. When you drop your net in, the salmon go along the net. And so when the people would use what they call a pipe plunger, they didn't plunge this way, they plunged that way. And so it was to turn the fish around back, so they go back around and around. Right? It's interesting, the months, January's raven, February's eagle, you know, you got it like that. And then we'll say when you get to March, it's like skin of the animal time, you know. And then when you looked at fish returning to river time and things like that, so they were very connected, we'll say, to an activity. For raven, being January, raven is a transformer. And so as a transformer, it's about changing consciousness. So you go into winter ceremony, you go into that myth world. And so in that, you go like, wow, this is the time, right? And eagle time is now to look at it, to find the vision of what it is to be connected to that culture from a different way of seeing it, right? With a lot more clarity. And so there's some really fascinating connection to what they call the months, you know. I spent all my life, when they talk about you being good at what you do, you have to spend 1,000 hours, I got about 3 in. You know, but it's just really, I'm just drawn to it. I'm fascinated about how they lived back then and what we might need to do in order to get back to a good relationship with watersheds and land and oceans, right? And if we're equipped with that wisdom, then I think we can do a good job.
Any idea how they would have got those big stakes in if they're at least 12 feet long?
Yeah.
6 feet in, at low tide, out of boats, or?
Yeah, what they do is that they would do both because they have pile drivers, and the pile drivers they would use. And I went to look at one that we found but left on the site up in the Nimkish Lake, and there's a beautiful little village there, and I couldn't lift it. You know, I'm 21, you know, I'm prime of my physical condition. I couldn't lift it. And I was kind of going like, that's a real husky man. But it was that thick, and it was the shape of a shark. So the person, you can tell on the bottom that they would use it for pounding, and it was amazing.
Has anyone tried to recreate a life-size fish trap?
My nephew in Campbell River did a rock one. And fisheries got all out of joint about that. And what he did is that he went on low tide and he got help from people. He had a design, used the design, and it was very successful. Yeah.
So like mini rock wall kind of thing.
Well, yeah, they use rock as well, right? Yeah. And so places like this are just perfect for wood. Yeah. You know, other places are really good for rock. Yeah. Same idea, right? Yeah. 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 There's a friend of mine, I haven't seen it because maybe I haven't just looked, but on Sandy Island, there's a rock formation, and they think that there might be reminiscences of an old rock fishery.
Wow.
Yeah. So the long weekend we're heading over, we're going to look at it. My wife's birthday on Monday, so that's the gift. I got to show you some rocks, honey.
That's awesome.
And you talked about the deep fish, how they would catch the deep fish
Yeah.
off chrome.
Yeah.
Is it hook and line?
Yes.
Yeah.
And what they did is that, you know, the design of the halibut hook is beautiful. They were able to get that, and also for cods. And I got a story of the chieftainship that I have amongst the Comox. Sathlut. Is that the ancestor went to Middlenatch. And in Middlenatch, that's where he did his fishing for rock cod and for a red snapper. And he would eat the rock cod, but he used the red snapper for oil, right? And so the hooks that they would use are designed for that. It's really amazing. A lot of bone, and you know, a lot of bent wood. Yeah, and so they had specific sites. Our friend Jesse Moran has done an archaeological piece of where all of that was, and we struggled with, should we let the public know about it? It's great material, but it's also where all our resources are. You know, for 2 summers we've had archaeologists come and do some work at the Condentry area, and those digs have produced some pretty amazing artifacts. One in particular that they discovered were all these little stones that had etched images on them, hundreds. And there was one in particular, was a face of a young woman with a particular hairdo, and that was 700 years old. The amazing thing is that in the second dig, they found almost the identical one in about early 1800s. And so you know that in terms of cultural continuity, those stones, I call them teaching stones, were really important, right? But the fact that those images are so close together, that design of hair was really important for the people, right? Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
So that would have been the Pentlatch home territory?
Yeah, Pentlatch territory. Yeah. And what we also learned from there is that there's no clam areas up there. They had to come down to the end of the spit, or was they over to Sandy Island to get their clams. So they brought all the clams by canoe loads up to their village up the river. I thought it's fascinating, you know. Yeah, getting their food all over the place. There was one tribe, they're called Chachetcht, and in a textbook they call it Chachetcht. But that's the group that lived on Point Homes, and they went toward Black Creek. But what they did is that they were elk hunters, and they were really proficient. And so their whole name and culture was wrapped around hunting of elk. And so really fascinating. Yeah, and so their hunting techniques and things like that were quite in demand, you know, so people married into them to get that knowledge. It's fascinating how they do things. Yeah, yeah. We like the way he hunts.
Did they trade fish for elk?
All kinds of things. Yeah, yeah. Some people were really good with cod, like the group that I come from, and in a textbook it's called Katemoot, but in our translation in Ayajutham it's Gatemu. And Gatemu translated means always inviting people to a feast. And that's one of the names that we have, right? And so you'll see the way things are written, and then when you actually get the definition of the word, you know, it's has a different thing. So like Iksen, Ik means good. Iksen means good weather or clear sky, or it can be on a metaphorical way, sun in human form. So it's kind of like, you know, language has depth to it, and so literal and symbolic in the way they define things. Yeah. And another one for the moon, it's called Thok, and it means clear sky at night, you know, or moon, moon chief. The word for sun in Ayajuthem is called dagam, and the word for moon, dagam. One is day, one is night. And if you say dagame, you're Canadian.
So we're going to go up the lead line. He's going to take us to the end of the trap and then kind of around the outside, around that. So you can split and go this way at that point, or we can all go together as a group of carrying. But the kids love this part the best.